For decades, minority communities in the United States have felt underrepresented and stereotyped by the main media providers in the country, and they have a reason to be concerned. Minorities own less than 8% of the media resources nationwide.
A small number of media conglomerates in this country that control a large number of broadcast licenses on the radio and on the television. So there is a legacy of media ownership that is largely peopled by white owners, and where you have minorities underrepresented. And even it seems outrageous in this time.
An underrepresentation that is more noticeable among Latinos, where even when the two leading Hispanic networks are owned by the big media conglomerates, and there's no Latino ownership on public media. In spite of the rising number in demographics and the increasing purchasing power of the community, Latinos are missing on the boardrooms of the media industry, lacking a real presence when it comes to ownership and decision-making.
We're the largest minority group in the United States. We comprise 15.1% of the total population, and the census projections indicate that within the next generation, minorities will comprise a majority of the U.S. population. Therefore, the economic welfare of our community, and indeed of the country as a whole, depends on our ability to position minority communities for jobs and economic growth opportunities.
Part of the FCC's mandate is to promote diversity and competition in the media, yet they have failed to do so in their own department with no Latino FCC commissioner since the Clinton administration. Hoping to bring more minority ownership in the licensed scene of the media property, the agency is currently proposing a series of hearings for the quadrennial review of media ownership in the U.S. But experts agree it will be a great challenge.
Now, Congress expects the Federal Communications Commission to ensure that minorities participate in jobs and economic growth opportunities represented in the media and telecommunications field. But candidly, the FCC has not fared particularly well in its efforts to increase opportunities for our communities.
There's not much that you can do from a policy perspective on that front. I think the real challenge is at the FCC to try to get the 5 commissioners who are there to see this as a real problem and to try to do things that will create incentives for more minority ownership of mainly broadcast properties.
And that is the question. Who can stand up to the FCC and the media conglomerates to push this agenda and lead the fight to balance the equation and achieve diversity in the world mass media?
Joe Torres, the last 2 big reforms, as part of the lobbying for them, it was promised that there would be more access for minorities and more ownership for minorities. Did either happen either time?
The last 2 reforms when it comes to at the FCC?
Yes.
Yeah, it hasn't. Minority ownership has actually been declining ever since the passage of the 1996 Telecommunications Act, where it allowed, for instance, in radio, one company to own as many stations as they want nationwide. It used to be that you can only own 40 stations, now they can own as much as they want. So you have a company like Clear Channel that went from owning 40 stations to 1,200 stations in a matter of years. They raised the cap on ownership of networks being allowed to own local television stations. So all this consolidation, what it does, it increases the barrier of entry for people of color. We don't have the economic wealth historically to buy radio stations, television stations. So as properties combine and consolidate, the cost of owning a station goes up. And the cost of competing, it becomes harder. If you have one radio station, now you're competing against Clear Channel in a city with 8 stations. It's very tough to compete. So it has actually decreased minority ownership. And because of the 1995 Adirondack versus Pena decision in the Supreme Court, implementing affirmative action policies has become much more harder now, even at the FCC. But on top of that, Congress in 1995 got rid of the tax certificate program, with Tyrone knows a lot about. So this was the best program ever created to date to try to help minorities become broadcast owners with an incentive for companies to get a tax break if they sell a station to a person of color. That's gone. That was like the program that really increased minority ownership. The most significant has ever been increased. So, but the FCC hasn't come close to even addressing these issues. And how do you discuss the legal issues to be on a solid legal footing so you can increase minority ownership? So the FCC has failed to do its job.
Tyrone Brown, for decades, companies were limited in what they could own. 5 television stations, 7 AM radio stations, 7 FM radio stations.
Those were the rules when I was at the FCC.
Well, even back then, when the big dogs couldn't own as much, it wasn't a golden age for minority media ownership.
You're absolutely right, and that's why we developed, among other things, the tax certificate to deal with the problem. But the reason why minorities weren't involved in ownership, in management, or very significantly in employment at that time is because of the legacy of discrimination that existed in our society. And that kind of thing takes decades to root out, and it's not completely rooted out now. The commission back then, looking at the legacy of discrimination, decided to take affirmative steps to try to encourage minority ownership. It imposed rather strong employment, affirmative action employment obligations on broadcasters during that period and on other telecommunications companies. We developed the tax certificate program, which, as Joe indicated, became the major instrument for securing minority ownership of broadcast properties. As a matter of fact, the largest minority-owned radio group, Radio 1, started off with a group of properties that it obtained under the tax certificate. It then was able to build a capital base to go forward and acquire other stations, whether tax certificated or not. Those kinds of starter programs have disappeared, and it makes it more difficult today than it was 30 years ago to get a foothold in the industry.